Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Justin Schenck. Justin, welcome.
Thomas, thank you so much, man. Excited to dive in and hopefully add some value to your audience today.
Thank you for that. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, man. I'm your typical entrepreneur of 2022, right? Multiple streams of income and almost accidental, really. But I always like to say I'm a podcaster, a speaker, and an entrepreneur. So 6 years ago, I started a podcast called The Growth Now Movement, which I've been fortunate enough to get some really cool accolades. Like Inc. magazine listed me as a top 8 podcast every entrepreneur should follow. And it's really gone on to build businesses and multiple streams of income for me, whether it be speaking all over the country on overcoming limiting beliefs and podcasting at times, or I also own a podcast production and coaching company, and I'm partnered in a number of other companies as well. And the show itself has really kind of branched off into my own live event called Growth Now Summit Live, where people come from all over the country and Canada, and hopefully one day the UK. They attend virtually so far, so we're trying to get them there in person, but really, really blessed and honored to be able to do what I do. And I think it all comes from the idea that I found my purpose and I poured into it authentically 100%. And now business has really, really sprung from it over the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you for the introduction. You touched on a few things that I want to ask you about, but I am going to start with the one which I find most interesting, which is your, I believe it's the case that you got a way of overcoming any limiting beliefs. Is that right?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that I've kind of discovered over my life, and I'll kind of share the journey with you of how it came to be, right? It's a simple 3-step process, but it's not easy to execute on, because anytime we have these limiting beliefs, they usually come from some place that we've decided to bury deep down inside, as far as where does it come from. And so as I really kind of went into my life and realized I've had these limiting beliefs on many different ideas in my world, like, why can't I be a millionaire? Why can't I stay fit 24/7? Why can't I do all these things? And I was like, where do these limiting beliefs come from? And I've done a ton of research, and I realized that limiting beliefs really come from 4 places. The first place is childhood. It can be as simple as, you're a shy child and your parents go around telling people, hey, Thomas is just shy, and that's okay. Now Thomas walks around the rest of his life thinking that he's shy. It also comes from society, right? Society says, hey, you're a woman, you can't do something. Hey, you're a minority, you can't do something. Or, hey, you grew up poor, so you could never become wealthy. Whatever the case may be, that's another place limiting beliefs come from. Also ourselves, right? That negative self-talk so many people talk about, right? We could go back to 6th grade and a woman or a girl says, you ask a girl out for the first time and she says, no, I don't want to. And for the rest of your life, you go, you're ugly, you're not good enough, you're all these things. And really, she never said that. You just said that yourself. And then the 4th place is really a subconscious. This is the one that I found out later. I originally found out the 3. And then later down the road, I found we have these subconscious limiting beliefs of things that may have happened to us in our life, and we've buried them. And so the first thing we need to do is realize, okay, where do these limiting beliefs come from? And that's really where the work begins, right? Like, where does it truly come from in our lives? Why do I feel this way? Why can't I overcome these things? And once you discover that, it's the simple 3-step process. So the first thing is you get uncomfortable. So you have to do something to get out of your comfort zone in order to kind of shake or rock that foundation that's inside of you. And I'll share a real life example after this, but the first one is get uncomfortable. The second thing is surround yourself with the right people, right? Those individuals that are going to cheer you on, that are going to support you in this journey, the ones that are going to, once you start to slip, they're going to pick you up and say, hey, don't slip, we got this. And then the third thing is take action, because nothing works unless you do. And so that's really the 3-step process, that if you're able to do those 3 things consistently, you're able to kind of break those negative self-talks, those limiting beliefs that we carry around. And something that as I began to kind of look into this, it was the end of 2020. When I was like, okay, these limiting beliefs are real, right? I did the typical COVID quarantine, gained the 20 pounds. And I was like, I need to do something about this. And I realized there was a pattern in my life of every time I would get fit or lose weight, I would gain the weight back. And I was like, why do I self-sabotage? What are these things saying in my subconscious, like that I shouldn't be the person who's physically fit? And I rewound to when I was 12 years old, which I broke my hips when I was 12. That's a whole nother story. But I remember finally getting to the point where I could walk again. It was about 9 months into recovery. And it was the time they were taking my crutches away. And I was sitting in the doctor's office, and the doctor was wrapping up. And my mom said, he can walk now. What are the long-term limits that he has to have or whatever? And the doctor goes, Well, he could pretty much do anything a 12-year-old can do, except he'll never be an athlete. And I remember that sentence hanging in the air. And that was the thing I buried back into the back of my brain. So whenever I would start to get physically fit or whatever, I would start to self-sabotage because I had that, oh, I can't be. And so in the beginning of 2021, I decided I'm going to squash those limiting beliefs. And I took that 3-step process. And the first step, again, getting uncomfortable. I decided to do something called 75 Hard. If you're not familiar, it's designed by a guy named Andy Frisella, which is 75 days straight, 2 45-minute workouts. One has to be outside, gallon of water, no cheat meals, no alcohol, progress photo, and 10 pages of a self-help or business book every single day. And so I committed to this publicly. I said on my podcast, I'm doing 75 Hard, which my podcast gets played in 100 countries every single week. So it was a big, uncomfortable commitment. The second thing is I surrounded myself with the right people. My girlfriend actually did 75 Hard with me, and she was there to, those times you want to slip or those times you want to cheat. She was there to be like, no, we're doing this together. And then the third thing is I took action. I actually did it and I completed it. And, I can honestly say in 2021, I worked out more than I had ever worked out in my life throughout the year. I've maintained some sort of physical stature. And actually, as we speak right now, I'm doing 75 Hard again. And so I've been able to commit to certain things in my life that I've never been able to commit to. And those limiting beliefs of me being the fit person in the room are no longer. And so that's the simple yet not easy 3-step process of overcoming those limiting beliefs.
Would you consider yourself an athlete now then?
It's funny. No, I don't. Because, I've had awesome athletes on my podcast and I see what goes into what they do. But day one of 75 Hard, the last year, I was taking that morning walk with my girlfriend, which is a 3-mile walk in the freezing cold. It was January 1st. And I looked at her and I go, babe, I'm an athlete. And she goes, yeah, you are. Number one, I was like, first of all, I had to say to myself, I'm an athlete at least once. And then the second thing was, that's how I knew I was surrounded by the right people. The fact that she would go as I was 25 pounds overweight. Yeah, you are. And so when I look at that, you always kind of want to squash it, but no, I'm certainly not an athlete, but I'm way more physically fit and way stronger than I've ever been in my life. And I'll continue to get better. And I think that's really the approach that I needed to take in my physicality was I'll continue to get better every single day. And yeah, so I'm not running sprints. I'm not doing the pole vault. I'm not, whatever athletes do these days. The Olympics are in my mind, obviously, but, definitely headed in the right direction for sure.
Any other significant beliefs that you've overcome that spring to mind?
Dude, they're constant. I think we have really collected a ton of limiting beliefs through our lifetime. And, as a child, I will say this. So I went through some rough times as a child. My mom battled opioids for 20 years. My dad was in jail at one point. And so because of those things, I developed something called, I had abandonment issues. And so these are things that I felt like I wasn't worthy of people sticking around for me. And that's something that I carried with me subconsciously for a really, really long time. I thought I had trust issues, by the way. And after therapy and coaching, I realized they were abandonment issues. And so, these were limiting beliefs based off of the way I was raised. Now, keep in mind, my parents were loving parents. Like they crushed the parent game. They just chose their demons over me. And so therefore I developed that I'm not enough mentality. And, through many times of coaching and uncomfortably having these conversations and then putting in the work to realize my worth, I've been able to overcome that and realize that I'm worthy of any relationship. Actually, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now that I've designed called Worthless to Worthy, which talks about that exact thing of like, hey, look, at any point, every single human being, including the amazing people that I've been able to interview on my podcast, they felt worthless. And so what's the work we need to do to feel worthy? And a lot of that is that overcoming limiting belief process. But I would say that's probably the biggest one, but there's also little ones along the way, right? Like I could never be a public speaker. I could never be an author. I could never be whatever. And so the author one I'm working on currently as I'm writing my book, which is a very uncomfortable process. But all these limiting beliefs that we've built up over time, we have to be able to overcome them.
What's the book about? Or is it spoilers?
So I'll tell you, it's about finding fulfillment, because I've realized that we can have these massive goals in our life, which are very, very important for a direction, but people tie their worth to their goals versus finding fulfillment every single moment. They think once they get to the goal, they're going to be happy. Once they get to the goal, they're no longer going to feel depressed or sad or unworthy or all these things. And it's actually the exact opposite. Most high performers, when they finally reach that massive goal they set for themselves, they feel more worthless. because they realize they don't have that feeling they expected. And so the book is really about finding fulfillment and focusing on what I call the 4 pillars of life, which is business, relationships, wellness, and spirituality. And so that's really the premise of it, tying in my own personal journey and my own personal stories, along with some of the incredible people I've interviewed on my podcast and their journey.
And you touched upon your journey from going from your difficult, should we say difficult upbringing? Would you say that that's accurate label?
Yes. In hindsight, yes, as I talk about it as an adult, but I think anytime somebody that goes through life and they go through hardships, it's almost just, this is just normal. I didn't know any different, right? Like I didn't know what it was like to grow up in a household where my parents were happily married. Like they got divorced when I was 12, right? I didn't know what it was like to whatever, like have that comfort of knowing when I got home, both my parents would be there and they'd be smiling. So therefore it wasn't, I don't know if it was necessarily difficult. It was interesting, right? Like I just heard somebody tell a story about how Coolio was having a conversation with Jimmy Fallon or something like that. And Jimmy Fallon was like, yeah, I was worried every day that I'd be picked on for my funny hair or whatever. And Coolio was like, oh, I was worried every single day that I would get killed in a drive-by shooting. But it was in their minds, it was still the same amount of worry. And so it was an interesting kind of reflection on like, everybody has their own trauma, their own journey, their own story. This one just happened to be mine. So I think it was kind of normal for me to go through it. Now, in hindsight, I realized that it wasn't normal to, have, and when I was 12 years old, my mom got arrested for stealing opioids from her job, or my dad had spent a couple of years in jail when I was in my teens. And so when I look at that, I understand it's not normal now. But I think the biggest thing was I didn't have the same opportunity as other people, right? Because of what I went through, I was a poor student because I chose not to engage. And I had a 1.7 GPA. So college wasn't the route I was going. And so for me, it's been a perpetual journey of growth. When I was 19 years old, I had a mentor. I got a direct sales job, which, taught me sales and communication and all the things that I utilize now in my business. But my mentor handed me a book called Who Moved My Cheese. And that was my introduction into self-development. And the idea that like, oh, wow, there are other people that go through hard times as well. And there are people that I can learn from. And from 19 till probably 30 was a constant evolution of me and a constant growth of me. And when I was 30 is when I really clicked on the podcast and started to have those conversations and really dive deep and then really put in the work of everything that I've learned from 19 to 30 and trying different things and implementing those things. And so it's a constant evolution that I'm still a work in progress. I always say to people like, hey, like if you find my podcast, you're coming on a journey with me. This isn't about you learning from me. Yes, there are times where I do solo episodes and I teach the things that I've learned, but it's really about us growing together. And I can learn from you just like you can learn from me. And just like my girlfriend's 11-year-old son, like I can learn from him just like he can learn from me. It's not ever that whole, like we've reached this epitome of, or this, the epitome of the greatness, right? And so for me, it's a constant journey. It's a constant evolution. Many, many failures along the way of my own, 3 failed businesses and so on and so forth. But for me, I have to constantly be learning and constantly be growing. And that's part of my fulfillment. And everybody has a different type of idea of what that means, but it's really about finding what is that for you.
Well, just following on from how I started was you've gotten to the place where you are a top-rated podcaster. And one of the things which I wanted to ask you about was common, shall we say, mistakes that podcasters make. Am I doing the mistakes before you answer the question?
No, I mean, so I don't really know. Most mistakes are in the beginning. And I made all of them. And that's why I can outright tell people what the mistakes are, because I made every single one of them. And I only learned by doing the mistakes. So back 6 years ago, when I had a podcast or started a podcast, I would tell people that I had a podcast and their response would be, what's a podcast? And so now I say I have a podcast and people roll their eyes and they go, oh, you too? Right. Because everybody's got one, which is not true, by the way. There's only 2 million podcasts on iTunes. And I think only 700,000 of them are active. So when you think about that compared to the amount of people in the world, but anyway, I digress. Everybody knows what a podcast is now. But so when I learned, it was really about, attempting things and really trying it on my own and seeing what worked and what didn't. And so I think a couple of the big mistakes that I see podcasters do. Number one, their launch is always wrong. A lot of the times it's wrong. And so what I mean by that is when you launch, you should launch with multiple episodes to understand your podcast audience, because they want podcast listeners are usually binge listeners, right? Like when this episode ends, it'll click to the next episode and your people will continue to listen. Like they become binge listeners of the show. So if you only give them one episode, they might go listen, but they're not going to stick around. They're not going to click subscribe. So you have to give them that bulk of the listenership from day one. Number two, your branding has to look really good. This is the thing, especially now compared to 6 years ago, which has become very, very important, is like you have to stand out. Like, what does your branding look like? How are you presenting yourself? Especially if you want to grow your audience and you want to grow the types of guests you have on your show and everything else in between. If you don't present yourself professionally, you're not going to do well, right? Like I always kind of liken this to like a Target. Do you guys have Target in the UK? Is that a really obnoxious question?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so Target's a huge brand here. It's a shopping store where you can get everything from Starbucks in the front to clothes in the back to electronics to home goods, all the stuff. Very, very popular in the United States. And so their branding is clearly very clean, professional, and on point. Like if you walked up to a store, and so Target literally says Target, and it's like red rings. It looks like a Target. So if I walked up and it said Target in a scribble letter, and next to it was a weird, funky looking half circle, whatever, I wouldn't even go in the store. So you have to present your branding and yourself very, very professionally in the front end. And then on the back end, what you're producing has to match the branding. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I'll find a podcast and it'll be called The Art of Being a Cool Guy. And I go in and I start listening, and not one episode is about the art of being a cool guy. So you have to make sure that the messaging inside of what you're presenting matches what you're presenting, right? Like the cover of the book tells you what the book's about. And then you read the book and you go, okay, this makes sense. The same thing should happen in podcasting, which is a massive mistake people make, or they'll pivot and they won't rebrand or whatever. And so I'll give an example of this and what I mean by like I made all the mistakes. When I launched my show, the first 64 episodes, I had a co-host. Number one, the reason I had a co-host, by the way, I'm very, very real and open about my journey. I had a co-host because I was afraid of failing on my own. So I said, if he comes along with me and we fail, at least we both suck. And it's not just me. That was the original idea. By the way, when we were together, we sucked. Nobody listened. It was a terrible thing. Like there was a moment actually when I wanted to quit, because I was like, I had 30 listeners an episode. I'm like, what am I even doing? I don't know who these people are. And you know, part of that story is actually pretty inspirational. In the time that I was like, I should just wrap it up. Like I'm just wasting my time. Somebody from Japan reached out to me and said, because of your show, I decided not to take my life. And the reason I share that is this is why I still show up and I still say yes to people who ask me to be on their podcast, no matter where they are, whether it's episode 1 or episode 100, because I realize there could be one person listening that I say something that changes their life. It might not be that extreme, but they might go, oh, you know what? I was thinking about podcasting and Justin said my branding needs to be on point. Maybe I should invest in that. Right. And that changes the game for many, many people. But anyway, back to what I was saying about the podcast. Our branding and our messaging didn't match. Because he was talking about business. I because of some of the things that I just recently went through, I was trying to talk about self-love and, you know, overcoming adversity and all the things that I still talk about today. But there was a mismatch. And so we didn't really hit the rhythm that we needed to for our audience to connect. And when I asked him to take a step back and I started to do episodes on my own, that's when I started to see growth. And so that's really the branding matching the messaging on the back end. And so this is what I mean by like, I made all the mistakes that you could possibly make. But those are some of the common ones that I see right off the bat. And then hopefully, you know, people learn to pivot and grow and you can always rebrand and relaunch and do all those things. But those are some of the mistakes that I see right from the get.
Does this touch on your background that we talked about before we started recording?
The podcast production and coaching. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely
literal background. The people.
Oh yeah, the background. Yeah. So this is, you know, what's funny about this? This is I have a background, people listening to this, not watching, I have a background behind me, which has some of the guests on my show, like Ed Milet and Andy Frisella and Trent Shelton and Gabby Bernstein and people like that. So this was the original social media post that I would do for every episode. So this was the original branding. It's different now. So it's funny because whenever I put new people on the wall, I have to rebrand them with the old one just so I can match them on my wall. So it's obviously I've evolved and grown, and the brand has evolved and grown. But the reason I want to point that out is I started doing this, and then all of a sudden I noticed like 10 other podcasters copying this format of the picture next to the title and stuff like that. And so then I was like, okay, I got to shift. And then I shifted to something that was worse than this for a while. And I could tell that it was worse because my engagement on social media went down. And now I've shifted again, and actually very, very similar to like understanding the trends of social media and how your brand works. The images that I create now, I only put in my Instagram story or I put on Facebook, and then I actually create reels for every episode now. And so that's really kind of reaches more people. But the reason I share that is because branding is very, very important from the get, but you also have to evolve with the times. The same thing that worked 5 years ago doesn't work anymore. And so you have to be able, it's another full-time job in order to keep up with all the brands or all the shifting of the social media, algorithm and all that stuff.
Well, you did say that you were talking about self-love initially in your first 64 episodes, I think it was. And one of your questions, which I did think was quite important of all the things that I could ask you about, is what are most people lacking in life in order to feel happy? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. What most people are lacking is the idea of self-care and self-love, right? So what I mean by that is I've interviewed, over 400 people. I think 418 episodes of my podcast, something like that. And a majority of them are interviews. And I ask the same question to every single guest. This is a two-part question. The first part is, what's your definition of success? And the second part is, what are the 3 things you do every single day to ensure that success for yourself? So obviously the first part was always different, right? Like, what's your definition of success? But I will say this, it was never about physical or tangible things. It was always about time freedom. It was about happiness. It was about connecting closer with their families or their loved ones. It was all that stuff. And then the second part was the 3 things you do to ensure that success. And it was always things to take care of themselves in some way, shape, or form. Working out, meditating, learning something new, downtime for yourself, whatever the case may be. Those 3 things that they did were always to make sure that they fill their own cup. And so the piece that people are lacking is that they look outside of themselves for happiness, instead of going inside and saying, what do I truly need? And what we truly need is to take care of ourselves and to make sure we take time to breathe and take time to focus on the things that make us happy. And so the things that people lack is they're trying so hard to make everybody else around them happy instead of themselves, because they think, hey, if my wife or my husband is happy or my kids are happy, then I can have a smile on my face. But guess what? You can't pour from an empty cup. And so you have to take the time every single day to make sure that you fill your own cup. And I've realized over the journey of the last 6 years is that the most selfless thing we can do is to be selfish. And so we have to take back our time, and we have to really make sure that we're operating on all cylinders for other people. And that's really the piece that people are missing, is that we think that happiness comes from the outside world, but it really comes from within. And so we have to be able to do the work to make sure that we are 100% ourselves every single day.
So what do you say when someone asks you, how do you define success?
I define success being able to do what I want to do when I want to do it with the people I want to do it with. Not the people I want to do. That's inappropriate. Thomas, I blame you for that. The people I want to do it with. And so what I mean by that is, ultimate freedom in my life. And this isn't defined, by the way, by wealth or things or anything like that. It's defined by being able to go off and do what I want whenever I want. If I want a cigar at 2:00 in the afternoon, I'll go outside and smoke a cigar. If I want to travel, I'll travel. If I want to spend time with, my girlfriend instead of doing work, I'll do that. And so success for me is having the ability to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. And it sounds very, very selfish, but if I'm able to do that, that means when I'm focused on work, I'm 100% focused on work. When I'm with my loved ones, I'm 100% focused on my loved ones. When I'm, whatever. And so being able to be present at any given time. And we do that by being able to create a world where we're no longer stressed out or distracted by the things around us. And so that's really my definition of success is the ability to live carefree 24/7. And it's not always perfect, but it's certainly striving to get there is close enough for me.
Would you say that you're happy then?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've never been so happy. And let me define what I feel as happiness. We think happiness is that joyful, exuberant, jumping up and down, constantly smiling type of thing. I don't think that's the case. Number one, happiness is a choice. We choose if we're happy or not. And so a number of years ago, I was going through some relationship struggles, and I had a relationship coach, and I remember getting really angry about something. And I was having a coaching call with her, and she goes, "Well, how do you feel right now?" And I said, "I feel angry." And her response was, "You're allowed to feel angry. You just can't be an asshole." And I paused in that moment, and I realized, yeah, it's funny how it's worded, right? But I paused, and in that moment, I realized this is the first time in my life I was given permission to be anything but happy. And what that evolved into is the realization that even though I'm at times angry, even though at times I'm stressed, even though at times I'm sad, even though at times I'm whatever, I'm also happy in those exact moments. Because happiness is much larger than just a moment. Happiness is the idea that I will get through this. Happiness is the idea that even when bad things happen, I understand that it's happening for me instead of to me. It's no longer playing the victim when things go awry around you. And so I actually literally believe that I choose happiness 24/7, even when I'm feeling all those other emotions.
Interesting. I've not heard that before. So thank you for the answer. We've touched on how many people you've interviewed and the fact that you've been podcasting for such a long time. What are the themes of the top performers that you've interviewed that you recall?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one thing I've already touched on is the fact that their daily habits are to focus on filling their cup. I think that's the biggest common theme. Now, keep in mind as we talk about this, and people who haven't heard my podcast, I've interviewed people from all walks of life. I've interviewed stand-up comics. I've interviewed reality stars. I've interviewed celebrity chefs. I've interviewed massive entrepreneurs. And so they all come from different walks of life, but every single one of them have reached the peak of what their success could be or what they defined it as, right? And so I would say definitely taking care of themselves is a common theme. The second thing is they constantly give more than they receive. And this is something that I organically have always done in my life. I'm a giver. And it's funny that I tell you this now, because now you know how I'm going to end our conversation, but I end every conversation with, if there's anything I can ever do to help you, please let me know. And if I can help people, I will. And if I can't, I try and find somebody who can. That's always my goal. And that was the common theme with every single person I've interviewed. Now, I don't know if that is every successful person in the world, but that's the people I'm clearly drawn to, right? Because we kind of vibrate on the same levels of, hey, I want to be able to help as much as I possibly can. And so I would say those are the two things. Number one, they make sure they take care of themselves in some way, shape, or form every single day and fill their cup. And number two, they give more than they receive.
And if someone asked you that question at the end of an episode, how can I help you?
This is the first time somebody's asked me this, man. So kudos to you. I should say on a podcast, right now, I think that my answer to that question, whenever I do get it, is, I can't think of anything right now, but certainly I appreciate the offer. And if I do come up with something, I'll ask, which I will, if it ever comes to that. But I would say more than anything to stay connected as human beings. I think over the last, let's just say 2 years, right? Like we'll just throw a random 2 years out there. The world has changed a lot. And I think the world has changed a lot because it's created massive divide and separation in what people believe and what they support and whatever. But the real power is in coming together. And so I think the way people can help me is to just stay connected. Don't allow one conversation to be one conversation. Allow ourselves to, even though we may disagree, to be one as human beings. And that's the way we can help. You can help me, and that's the way we can help the world. And I think that's the big shift right now that we all need to create is massive togetherness, even when we don't agree. And I think that if we can get to there as human beings across the globe, as we talk in the United States and the UK, if we can figure that out across the globe, a lot of the world's problems will be solved.
Great point. In terms of, I know that podcasting, in a sense, can be its own business. But you mentioned you had a side business. Do you mind talking about that for a bit so people know what you do?
Yeah, man. So it's a side business, but no, it's not. Like it's just Justin Schenck business, right? So obviously my podcast does generate an income, which is, something I'm really, really grateful for. But it's really led into other opportunities for me, both in the podcast space and outside of the podcast space. So my brand has grown enough where I get to speak and I get paid to go speak all over the country and talk about the things I like to talk about. But I've also really kind of launched that into my own live event called Growth Now Summit Live, which I hold in Pennsylvania, but we also have a virtual option as well. Which we're about to turn that on. It's going to be a free option for people to be able to tune in and check that out wherever they are on the globe, which is really exciting. And so obviously that's part of my business. But then in the podcast space, I help people launch and produce their shows, and I work with some of the biggest names in the world, which has been really, really exciting and rewarding to be a part of their journey and their growth. And then I also am partners within 2 podcast businesses. One is a podcast branding service. And that started because I had that conversation that we had earlier about podcasters branding needing to be better. And somebody came to me and said, hey, do you want to partner with me in this idea that I have? And so that's that actually, if people are interested, that's podbrand.io, where we help podcasters, take their branding to the next level and help them grow their show that way. And then the other one's a podcast guesting service called Podcong, which is a high-end guaranteed reach podcast guesting service where we work with people who are looking to, whether it's build their brand, launch a new book, launch a business, whatever, we help them get on shows to help them kind of expand their reach from that standpoint. But yeah, man, I think for me, at the end of the day, is everything that I do is to help further my message, but then also help others further theirs, because we all have something really, really important to say. And so every single business that I say yes to be a part of, it's always about helping people expand their message and impact the world in some way, shape, or form. And so I would say that, yes, all these are side businesses in some way, shape, or form, but they're all impact driven, whether it's my own impact or the impact of others. And that's always been my mission. And organically, I've been given the opportunity to be a part of some really cool things that help people do that.
I can tell podcasting is a big sort of impacted your life in a way. Where do you see it going in the next, let's say, 10 years?
That's a great question. So I would say actually even more now than it used to. And I admittedly missed the boat on this one. But the visuals of podcasting, people watching more, Rogan-esque, right? Like how it's more of a show. I think big media brands are going to continue to play a bigger role in podcasting. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't have that answer yet. But they're going to continue to see the power in it, right? You see Spotify buying up all these things, and you see all these companies investing in it because of the reach. Let's look at it this way, right? Joe Rogan's reach is 10 times more than CNN. And so as we see that and those platforms being able to grow and expand, you're going to see the power of podcasting become more extreme. And as our technologies expand and it's easier to listen to, you're going to have more and more people listening to podcasts. And so I think more than anything, if your branding is not on point, do it now, because the big brands are coming in more and more every single day, and they're going to start to squash the little man. And so we need to step up big and again, come together and see how we can help each other. But yeah, man, I just see it growing. And what I meant by the way, the video side of things and where I missed the boat, I have all my episodes on YouTube. You can go listen to all 400 plus. They're on YouTube, but it's literally a still image until recently, which I've been uploading the videos because I record over Zoom like you. And so I've been uploading the videos and before the pandemic, I said, why would I upload these videos? Nobody wants to sit down and watch 2 people side by side talking to each other. And here we are living in a world where every single person is watching people sitting side by side. And so, yes, I do upwards of 10,000 downloads per episode on my podcast, but my YouTube does like a whopping anywhere from 2 views to 200 plus views. And so I'm doubling down now on the podcast on YouTube and seeing what I can do there. So I'm working on that branding and working on that kind of style. But it's intriguing to be like, I really kind of wish that I was just taking the time back the last 6 years uploading all these interviews, because I didn't do that. And I missed that boat. So hopefully people can double down and do that now.
There is something which maybe you can help me with. Selfish question. that I wrestle with sometimes, which is I know that there are best practices. So, for example, I know that there are studios that you could actually, let's say you go get a studio for your podcast, you look a lot more professional than you record it in an office room like I'm doing right now. But I do like, personally, from my own perspective, I do like being able to do it from anywhere. So sometimes I'll do it in my office, sometimes I'll do it in this room, sometimes I'll do it from home. And sometimes I'll use the green screen, sometimes I won't, depending on what my preferences are. And so I did come to the conclusion that I'm just going to do it the way that I want to do it. And then I can see some sustainability or longevity to doing it that way, versus, as you say, that there are branding principles and best practices, and what the differences are there in terms of what you should and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. So I'll say this, man, for most people, podcasting is a labor of love and a passion. And so whatever is going to allow you to live your passion the way you want to live it, that's what I highly recommend. I've been able to grow a massive brand with my podcast, and I started with a $60 microphone, and I used that $60 microphone until about a year ago. And so, and then I was like, yeah, I guess I should, invest a little bit now. Like now I have a Shure microphone, or I wear a headset sometimes, which is like, was stupid. I'm like, why did I pay? It was like $500 for 2 headsets. I'm like, what am I doing? So anyway, so that part doesn't really matter as much as you'd think, especially if you don't have a ton of money on the back end of your brand. Now, if you really are focusing on video, I highly recommend, like that's where you want to push people. I highly recommend investing in a camera, maybe getting sustainability with what your background looks like. But it really depends on what you're focusing on. If you're focusing on the audio, which I did for many years, and I won that way, then that doesn't matter. The background doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't matter. Like I said, my background has really become just a networking tool, and that's why I still have it. But with that being said, I think, really being focused on what's going to make it the most fun for you and make sure that you continuously stay in your passion. Now, if it starts to generate an income for you and then it makes sense to go brand it, cool. Dude, like I said, I work with some of the biggest brands in the world, but influencer brands, I mean, not necessarily like Target or whoever, even though you don't know what Target is, which is crazy to me. But I work with some of the biggest like influencer brands, and they don't even have a commonality behind everything that they're doing. And so that part doesn't matter. What really matters in podcasting, and I think part of the reason I love it so much, is it's the content. Like it really, really matters how good the content is that you're giving to your audience. Because what happens is, say Jim Bob's listening to the show and he's like, this is really good content. Well, he's going to tell his friends and says, hey, look, you're into this stuff. Like I'm into this stuff. It's really good content. You should listen to it. And that's really the main focus. And then that whole idea of like where you're sitting when you're recording and stuff like that, that's secondary. I mean, I know people who've started massive podcasts and they record it while they're driving down the road. Do I recommend that? Absolutely not. But you can absolutely do that if your content's really, really good.
Is there anything that I should have asked you about today?
No, man, I think you've done a phenomenal job. Like you got me on a question nobody's ever asked me in the way that you asked me it. No, I've really enjoyed our conversation.
What are your goals, Justin?
My goal is to be more abundant in what I have in my life and who I am in my life. And what I mean by that is I told you that my main focus is to give more than I receive. So if I'm more abundant, it means I can give even more. And so my ultimate goal is to just be more abundant in what I have than what I have now. And I don't mean physical things, by the way. I just mean in my ability to give. And so that's really my goal. And so it's really funny. They're like, you talk to all these entrepreneurs and they have, set your goals and set a timeline and do all these things. I've got goals. Like for my live event, I would love to fill an arena one day, but I don't put a timeline on it. And I'm going to share with you why, because if I set a timeline of, I want to fill an arena in 3 years at my live event, and all of a sudden 3 years later, I'm still doing my live event. It's successful. I've got a lot of people coming. I'm changing lives. And by the way, successful means I'm changing lives. It doesn't matter if there's 10,000 people in the room or 100 people in the room. It's still a success. And 3 years later, it's successful. I just didn't fill that arena. So I didn't reach my goal. And all of a sudden I'm down on myself. I don't feel worthy anymore, all these things. And so the goal gives me a direction. It gives me something to push for. It gives me something to reach for, but I'm not going to tie my worth to it. And what happens is we look at our goals and the setting of the timelines as essentially like an antidote to the symptoms that we have. We're looking at for the cure for all the things that we're struggling with and going through. And we need to find that happiness, like I said earlier, within ourselves. And so I have goals. They're fun goals. I hope that I reach them one day, but I have no timeline for it. Now, every day, do I work towards it? 100%. But I don't have a timeline for any of that stuff. And so I think my big goal is a 10,000 people or 6,000 people in arena. I say 6,000 because we have a local arena to me that fits 6,000 people. I would love to sell it out one day. But I'm not going to tie any of my worth to it. So my real goal is I'm going to be better tomorrow than I am today.
Any stoic influence there?
I'm not even that smart, man. I had a 1.7 GPA at one point in high school. So
that
maybe
sounds very much like a limiting belief to me.
Sometimes our limiting beliefs can be reality as well. And so look, I'm a really hard worker. I know how to surround myself with the right people, but I'm not book smart. So when you say stoicism, sure. Yeah, that's where it's from.
All right. Well, I think you've been a fantastic guest. I very much thought that you would be. But if people want to learn more about you or perhaps hire you, where can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest place, wherever they're listening to this, they can search Growth Now Movement. Like I said earlier, if they like it, click subscribe, come along on the journey with me. And then if they, Instagram's a really cool spot that I like to hang out a lot. It's at Justin T. Schenck there. You can see how to spell the last name in the show notes because nobody gets that right. And then, with all that being said, if they want to work with me in some way, shape, or form, they can just reach out on Instagram because there's so many places they can work with me. It all depends.
Justin Schenck, thank you very much.
Dude, Thomas, thank you so much, man. I appreciate this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I look forward to staying connected.